Good afternoon and welcome to this another installment of the Humane Philosophy Project Ian Ramsey Centre seminar. To begin with, I'd like to help the sponsors of this event that have made it possible. Ian Ramsey Centre, first of all, the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Warsaw, my alma mater, the Humane Philosophy Project, and also Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Edward Kantarian, who was a lecturer in philosophy at Trinity and Jesus in Oxford after finishing his PhD, his DPhil, here in Oxford, and then from 2011 was a lecturer in philosophy in Kent University, where he also works today. So Edward is interested mostly in topics that are connected to totalitarianism and Central and Eastern Europe, recently at least, Nazism and communism, the history of crimes such as the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust, and the ethics of memory. However, he also works on Kant's philosophy, and his book, Kant, God and Metaphysics, was published by Routledge in 2017. And today, Edward Kantarian is going to talk to us about medieval communism. So please join me in giving Edward a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and thank you very much for this invitation as well. I should maybe say that I'm very happy to be back in Oxford. I haven't been here since the pandemic started. In fact, yeah, for 4 years I think I haven't been here, so it's very nice to be back. And I should also say something about this topic, why medieval communism. It sounds rather obscure. It is simply part of a much larger book that have been writing ever since the pandemic started, on a sort of intellectual history of communism and the idea of communal and shared goods. And this is a sort of glimpse I'm giving you into one of the chapters of my book, which is not yet finished. Okay, it will be hardly contentious to say that private property and the private ownership of the means of production are central elements of most economies today. This is true even where the public or the state have a controlling share in a company. For example, while some of the biggest Chinese enterprises remain state-owned, they are run like de facto private companies. Chinese CEOs follow the Western model of success-based executive remuneration. The desire to be a well-off owner and consumer as an individual is surely held dear in most parts of the planet by now. The global triumph of this possessive individualism, to use a phrase invented by the Canadian political scientist C.B. Macpherson in 1962, is viewed with great suspicion by many educated people today. It is, however, an important trait of our time. We should not doubt its existence, but explain it and, if necessary, develop normative responses to it. Macpherson's own explanation of the rise of possessive individualism was that it all started with Hobbes, who was the first to give a coherent articulation of the new capitalist commercial society as it emerged in the 16th century. This notion of individualism, resting on the idea of self-ownership, was then further improved by the Levelers and Locke, Macpherson argued. For example, the lawless and masterless natural men Hobbes described in the Leviathan were not so much denizens of an actual primitive stage of human history, but rather an idealized type of the self-interested individuals Hobbes saw around him in the English bourgeoisie of the 17th century. In other words, the noble savage was simply the propertied Englishman minus the state. I won't dwell much on the shortcomings of Macpherson's thesis. Other people have done this on my behalf, for example, Isaiah Berlin himself. The origins of capitalism have, by increasingly more sophisticated historical research, been pushed further and further into the past. Some have claimed, as you well know, such as Max Weber, that capitalism originated in the German and Swiss Reformations, the so-called Weber-Toni thesis. Some claimed it originated in the commercial revolution of the Italian Renaissance, some in the rise of the profit economy in the later Middle Ages, while others still wish to locate it in the 10th or 11th centuries, or indeed in the 8th century, according to a book by a Harvard historian, Michael McCormick, published in 2001, Origins of the European Economy. While the quest for the terminus a quo of the origins of capitalism may not be a very fruitful undertaking, Macpherson's notion of possessive individualism does seem to me to offer us a terminus ad quem of when an important aspect of modernity could be completed. Namely, when the idea of economic man will be generalized to the whole planet and to as many aspects of human life as possible. But I'm not here to offer you a Marxist critique of this development. The truth is that the planetary success of possessive individualism is quite weighty evidence against Marx's assessment of capitalism. As a number of historians of capitalism have pointed out, capitalism has proven to be a remarkably flexible and endurable way to organize our economies. One of the reasons for this is that it is precisely not simply enriching the rich. It is not simply the exploitation of the masses, but rather the affordable mass production for the masses, as Werner Plumpe, a German historian of economics, has recently put it in a quite impressive book of the title Das kalte Herz Kapitalismus, die Geschichte einer andauernden Revolution. So the cold heart, capitalism, a history of a permanent revolution. But as communism has become discredited, might we not have lost something important suggested by its doctrine? So far, I have followed the usual understanding of communism as a purely economic doctrine and system, as its antipode, capitalism, is also usually understood. But the core idea of communism is common ownership, and this idea has a much older and richer history, present already in the antiquity, and then deepened and institutionalized in the Middle Ages. To work out a richer version of communism, I will therefore focus now on medieval communism, as it was debated but also lived in the 13th and 14th centuries. The term medieval communism might sound like an oxymoron. Were property relations in the Middle Ages not characterized by multi-layered vassalage relations, relations of dependency from a lord, a dominus, a ruler, but also an owner of land, ultimately a king or an emperor? And was the church not one of the biggest landowners? Indeed, around 1900 AD, it was the biggest owner, possessing approximately 1/3 of all cultivated lands in Western Europe. In fact, communism was very much alive in the Middle Ages, both as an ideal and as a communally lived experience. Indeed, if by communism we understand the rejection of private property and an acceptance that all goods are to be owned in common, then the ideal of communism can be traced back to the ancients. The myth of the communist golden age, when the earth was common property to all humans and there were no divisions of property, can be found in the writings of numerous authors, especially in the Sophist and Stoic traditions. Let us call this earth communism. Thus, in his epistle number 90, Seneca writes that once upon a time, humans, I quote, enjoyed all nature in partnership. Nature sufficed for them, and this her gift consisted in the assured possession by each man of the common resources. We once possessed the whole world, unquote. But we then lost this blissful state. In a move typical for much of pre-modern understanding of communism, Seneca introduces an ethical criterion. Private property emerges as a consequence of moral corruption, of the emergence of covetousness, and of being avaricious, greedy in our souls. I quote again Seneca, "Man ceased to possess all things, the moment they desire all things for their own, unquote. Aristotle, of course, rejected communism. As he argued in the Politics, the abolition of private property is contrary to our nature and a risky project because we do not know of any successful communist states. Incredibly, this is still true today. Private property, when enjoyed in measure, is a natural source of happiness, he argued, and also a precondition to develop certain virtues, such as the virtue of liberality. For it is only through the use of articles of property that the virtue of liberality can be developed. This implied a distinction between, on the one hand, property, and on the other hand, its use, also made by the Stoics. Private property is morally neutral. It is its use which may be good or bad, depending on our ethical standing. Communism, Aristotle argued, may sound attractive and humane, but the evils of a political order, such as corruption, must not be blamed on the absence of communal ownership. I quote Aristotle here, "They arise out of the depravity of human character," unquote. With the arrival of Christianity, the plot became more twisted. Earthly possessions and money are viewed with great suspicion in the New Testament and by some of the church fathers. Jesus himself said that, as you know, it is easier for a camel to go through a needle's eye than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. He encouraged his disciples to go on their wanderings without money and provisions and advised the rich to sell their possessions and donate to the poor. The members of the early church at Jerusalem that emerged after he departed or died are said to have renounced their private possessions and shared all things in common, distributing to each according to their needs. But did Jesus actually preach the private property is intrinsically bad? This is less clear. He did not say that it is impossible for the rich to enter heaven, nor that it is obligatory for them to renounce their private possessions. His point was about losing track of what truly matters, one's soul in its rapport with God. And it is this gravely distorted, and this can be gravely distorted by greed for and ownership of earthly goods. The church fathers maintain an equally ambivalent attitude towards private property. Some, like St. John of Chrysostom, who died in 407, were more inclined to view private property as intrinsically unjust and evil. He reverted to earth communism. God has given the earth to all humans for equal share. It is unjust to claim exclusive possession over some land. By division between mine and thine, this frosty expression, he writes, malice and war arise. But other church fathers, like Clement of Alexandria, appealed to the ancient distinction between property and its use, and argued that property as such is neither good nor evil. As he wrote in the Pedagogus, the tutor, published in, or written in 198 AD, I quote, "Wealth seems to me to be like a serpent, which will twist round the hand and bite, unless one knows how to lay hold of it without danger by the point of the tail." Thus, the use of private property can be good or bad. It is rather the human will which decides, or the human will and morality together which decide what is good or bad. In fact, human will itself is the bearer of what is of good and bad. And it is this that requires our main attention, not the abdication of possessions. At any rate, the Church Fathers, indeed Christian thinkers in general up to the 13th century, maintained that the communal ownership of the earth, as once found in the Golden Age, ought to be our true economic ideal, even though, as many of them were willing to concede, private property remains a reality for humans in their fallen state. But a more radical strand in Christianity, related to its otherworldly focus, never died out. It gave rise to an austere and ascetic form of life, first with the hermits in the deserts of Syria and Egypt, later in a more organized form in the medieval monasteries, and finally in the 13th century in the orders of the Dominican and the Franciscan friars. In addition, there appeared in the Middle Ages, especially from the 12th century on, non-clerical and even anti-clerical popular movements such as the Valdesians, the Beguines, Cathars, Lollards, Taborites, the Münster and Moravian Anabaptists, the Diggers, etc. Most of these groups were peaceful, not all of them, not the Münster Anabaptists and also not the Taborites, but most of them were at any rate, in principle, peaceful, and they were also in principle aiming for a devout life in the footsteps of Jesus and the apostles, renouncing private property. True Christian perfection, it was widely believed, was achieved through humility, abstinence, and the community of possessions. The Franciscan position, however, was still more complex. Saint Francis, who died in 1226, insisted on the disavowal of our earthly nature. I quote him, "Let us hate our body with its vices and sins, for by living carnally, it wants to take from us our love of Christ and eternal life," unquote. Saint Francis lived what he preached. I quote from an observation by somebody who met him, "His habit was sordid, his person contemptible, and his face unkempt," unquote. Only through strict obedience, chastity, and poverty was the heart to be purified from evil cravings. This entailed a rejection not only of private property, and especially money, as in the case of the monks. The monks had rejected private property, but they had accepted communal ownership, which eventually corrupted the monks because, as we know, their monasteries acquired enormous wealth and lands in time, sometimes in great quantities. As a consequence, Saint Francis and his immediate followers considered all forms of property a mark of sin. They assumed that neither in the Garden of Eden nor in the apostolic community there had existed anything other than the mere use of the goods necessary to stay alive. Renouncing all possessions and associated legal rights, the friars vowed to live in evangelical and absolute poverty by means of begging and menial labor. Poverty, it was understood, was bare use of consumables without ownership. Two clarifications are here in place. First, it should be noted that the Franciscan take on property cannot be described as communism in the sense of shared ownership, because that still is a form of ownership. However, we can introduce a distinction here, namely between, on the one hand, communism of property and, on the other hand, communism of use, and describe the Franciscans' view as a communism of use. Presumably the most radical form of communism that we can conceive of. Why can we speak of a communism of use here? Because the goods which the friars limited themselves to, at least initially, were just those that had been given by God to all humans before the fall, if in a more abundant form than the frugal goods the friars were supposed to consume to stay alive here and now in our fallen state. It should be mentioned that the idea of a communism of use bears some similarities with none other than Marx's own vision of communism, which he sketched around 6 centuries later. For in Marx's vision, the state itself will eventually wither away, and with it all ownership, including property law and rights. In this reign of true freedom, humans will be able to do and use whatever they please. One difference, of course, between the Franciscan version of communism and Marxian communism is that the former is about bare subsistence, while the latter promises lavish consumption. Still, both are forms of communism of use. Maybe the Franciscans were even more communistic than Marx. Second clarification, the friars' communism of use faced in time a number of practical and conceptual challenges. Due to its popularity, the Franciscan order grew in size, ambition, and endowments. For example, the friars started to need movable goods other than food and tunics, such as, for example, utensils and books. Donors were also happy to supply the order with immovable goods, such as buildings and lands, and eventually even money. To adjust to these new realities, a series of papal bulls, 1229 to 47, extended the range of goods the friars were allowed to use without entailing the possession of the goods, and even allowed for the employment of money and the purchase or sale of goods, as long as this was done through the mediation of special agents, amicis spiritualis, the nuncios, and then the procurators. But given this increasingly legalistic approach, it was difficult to avoid the impression that the order was moving away from St. Francis's austere precepts and becoming rather worldly and wealthy. The friars tried to avoid this problem by getting the papacy to become, purely formally, the owner of the goods of the friars, which they were entitled to use but not own. Not everybody, however, was convinced by this legal fiction. As one critic, Gérard of Abbeville, who died in 1272, pointed out, first, it makes no sense to speak of ownership, as in the case of papal dominion of Franciscan goods, if the owner is in principle not to draw any benefits from the use of those goods. And second, in the case of consumables, a strict distinction between mere use and ownership cannot even be drawn. When you give me an apple to eat, I own it as I use and consume it because it becomes part of my body. Bonaventure replied in the Apologia Pauperum, published in 1269, that first, so Bonaventure was himself a Franciscan, of course, so he defended his order against Gérard. So he replied that first, the papacy actually did draw some benefits from its ownership of Franciscan goods, namely spiritual benefits. And second, that just as a son living under the roof of his father can consume what is the father's, equally the friars can consume what is the pope's without appropriating those goods in the sense of true ownership. Moreover, Bonaventure distinguished between property, possession, usufruct, and simple use, simplex usus, and claimed that while the first three did entail legal rights, the last did not, so simple use did not entail any legal rights, but was necessary, indeed a duty for the bare subsistence of life, also for the friars. Not everybody, however, was convinced by these replies by Bonaventure, and especially by the avoidance of a language of rights, as in the case of simple use. Indeed, in the bull Exit Qui Seminat from 1279, which was supportive of Bonaventure's position, the legal concept of right of use was introduced into the debate, and eventually, simple use itself was subsumed under the category of rights, namely of the natural or human right to bare subsistence. So human rights in 1279, at least a first glimpse it would appear. Without going into the fiendishly complex details of the Franciscan poverty debate, which spanned around 100 years and I think is at least as interesting as the medieval debate about universals, I think more interesting because it has practical consequences. Universal debate doesn't have any practical consequences. We can draw two preliminary conclusions here. First, the conceptually sophisticated debate helped to formulate important moral and legal ideas. Second, the Franciscan rejection of all property through a communism of use had its clear limitations. It was only possible within the protective framework of an institution or agent, the church, that had to assume ownership, be it even as a legal fiction. Maybe a universal communism of use can therefore not be achieved, but only be attempted in smaller communities based on a moral ethos and devoted to the spiritual moral development of its members or their members. These, however, are not the only lessons we can draw from later medieval communism. For a deeper probing, let us now consider the case of three scholastic philosophers who all embraced a form of communism of use: Peter Olivi, William of Ockham, and John Wycliffe. As the theories of property and poverty are extremely complex, I will limit myself to just a few aspects of these theories. Olivi is an interesting case in point for my discussion because of two aspects of his work that seem to stand in tension with one another. On the one hand, he belonged to the more radical wing of the Franciscans, the so-called spirituals, as opposed to the more moderate, conservative wing, the conventuals. Olivi argued at length that the friars must live a life of absolute austere poverty, of bare or pure or poor use, usus pauper, as Christ and St. Francis themselves had done. On the other hand, he developed a theory of economics which anticipated important aspects of modern capitalism. Some call him the most original economic thinker of the Middle Ages. Indeed, he has received praise by none other than Murray Rothbard, one of the leading figures of extreme libertarianism, so capitalism gung-ho. For example, Olivi argued that 1. The price of a good is determined by its scarcity and our subjective want. 2. The merchant is a crucial intermediate between producers and consumers, evening out differences between abundance and scarcity, thus preventing the economy from collapsing. 3. The merchant is justified in charging a profit margin as he stores up goods when the market is saturated, which is costly to the merchant, and then sells them when they are again in demand. 4. That the merchant serves the common good, as without him goods would be even more scarce. 5. Lending goods and money entitles the merchant to charge an interest, as he could have done something else profitable with them instead. And 6, he even distinguished between so-called passive sterile money on the one hand and what he called capitale already, namely money which is put into use and has a seed for profit, investments. So Marx would come up with a very similar view much later. Poverty and capitalism, how is Olivi's paradox to be explained? The answer is, in order to understand the inner challenges of his chosen way of life, he had to investigate them in depth, and he so came across all these interesting insights about capitalist economy. The spirituals were very wary of the corrupting tendencies of the order's growing success and wealth, and sought to return to the austere observation of St. Francis' rule. The conventuals argued that usus pauper was not part of what was meant by evangelical poverty, and was not covered by the rule. One could vow to abide by the rule, digress from usus pauper, and still not commit mortal sin. Poverty, according to these moderates, simply meant lack of ownership. Olivi, by contrast, went to great lengths to refute this, developing a subtle moral psychology in the course. What exactly is a vow, he asked, and what counts as its definitive violation? One case or persistent diversion from it? What is the relation between theory and practice? Is evangelical poverty just an inner resolve or an actual practice, or both? Against Augustine's not use of things, but desire for them is to be blamed, and the wise man can use the most precious food without sin, Olivi pointed out that while covetousness does carry primary blame, the outer is not entirely external to the inner. Rather, some forms of use, namely poor use, are more arduous than others, and therefore more conducive to combating covetousness and lead to virtue, especially when combined with a renunciation of property rights. While rich use, usus dives, may be on occasion unavoidable for survival or due to human weakness, as Olivi was happy to accept, persistent rich use combined with smugness about it is a mark of moral corruption and, in the case of the friars, mortal sin. Olivi's aim was to, I quote, exterminate the roots of cupidity and its cunning tricks and stratagems, unquote. Because use is not morally neutral, but both expressive and affecting the moral standing of the soul, he explored how our insatiable cupidity arises not just from our character, but also the seductive nature of external goods themselves. This strikes me as a more realistic approach to the study of our own materialistic consumerist proclivities, our modern possessive individualism, than the Stoic patristic distinction between ownership and use, which may be valid only for the very rare case of the super-rich saint who is entirely unaffected by his riches. But yeah, name me one such example. For the rest of us, it does not matter what sort of objects we surround ourselves with, possess and use. I'm so sorry, this was exactly the opposite. For the rest of us, it does matter what sort of objects we surround ourselves with, possess and use. And this insight may be important in order to understand the deeper moral roots of consumerism and capitalism today. As our own usus dives, our rich use, the enormous levels of consumption of external goods and the resulting quantities of waste, including greenhouse gases, threaten not just our inner virtue, but the life of the whole planet. In a world in which pleasure and comfort are highly valued goods, many will find, of course, the Franciscan way of life crazy or abstruse. But we should at least consider that for those who believed sincerely in it, as Olivi did, absolute poverty may have moral payoffs. Olivi, at least, believed that usus pauper offers no less than 15 fruits. I have mentioned some of them on the handout if you are curious about them. We may consider these fruits for two reasons, I think, today, whether or not we want to follow the Christian path. Either for the utilitarian reason of restricting our environmentally damaging consumption, or as a means to prepare ourselves for an age of scarcity, which may well return. As Olivi suggests, citing Bonaventure, citing the Gospel, having food and sufficient clothing, let us be content with these. A related paradox seems to arise when we consider William of Ockham's and John Wycliffe's versions of communism. There are in fact two challenges here. One is to explain whether and how their metaphysical outlooks relate to their practical philosophies. The other challenge consists in explaining how it was possible that two thinkers with opposing metaphysical outlooks, nominalism and realism, could end up endorsing essentially the same doctrine about property. So let's start with Ockham. According to a once upon a time influential interpretation by Michel Vieille, there was an intimate connection between Ockham's nominalism and his political philosophy. Ockham's nominalism had two aspects, one concerning the question of what there is, the other, the question concerning the reality of the categories, of Aristotle's categories, that is. He assumed that Aristotle was wrong to assume that there were 10 categories. In fact, there were only two, substance and quality, and claims involving any other of the categories, especially quantity and relation, were entirely statable in terms of substance and quality alone. It follows then that qualities and properties do exist according to Ockham, in the sense that they are predicable of substances and even as individuals, as individual qualities. To cite here an important Ockham expert, there are as many whitenesses as there are white things, but there is no universal whiteness. But it does not mean that these individuals exist as universals, individual substances. The question of what there is arises here. According to Ockham, there are no universal beings, no essences, common natures, etc. in the real world. Everything there is individual and singular. Ockham argued that all statements about the real world are statements about individuals, and thus that even general statements or statements about groups or collectives are in the last instance reducible to statements about individuals. Michel Vieille took this nominalism as the foundation of what he viewed as the main doctrine of Ockham's political philosophy, namely Ockham's invention of the individual or subjective rights. This invention for VA was a disaster, as it ushered in the pernicious anti-communitarian and ultimately anarchical doctrine of modern political liberalism. VA's thesis has been subjected to extensive criticism, especially by Brian Tierney, who pointed out that, one, Occam's theory of rights was neither anarchical, it was conceptualized in a framework consisting of natural rights and law, and it was justified by appeal to right reason. And two, it was actually not Occam's invention, but went back to claims and arguments made by canon lawyers in the 12th century, for example, Huguccio. But what seems to me particularly perplexing about VA's thesis is his neglect of the most obvious anti-individualistic aspect of Occam's political doctrines, his communism. As a Franciscan friar, Occam was involved in the 1320s and 1330s in a dramatic clash between the papacy and his order. Building on the arguments against Franciscan communism of use, which I have reviewed above, Pope John XXII not only denied that it is possible to have licit use without ownership claims, and two, that the Church may have only nominal but no real ownership of Franciscan goods, but even pronounced the positive right to private property sacred. And why? Because it apparently had been given to Adam and then Eve already in the Garden of Eden. The Pope therefore refused to hold the dominion over the Franciscan goods and consumables, and as you can imagine, that really undermined the whole existential foundations of the order. Occam, therefore, was enrolled to write a defense of the Franciscan position, which he did, not least in the massive Opus Nonaginta Dierum, so the work of 90 days, published or written in 1332. He argued that licit use could be either based on positive right, jus fori, or natural right, jus poli. The papacy had given the friars a license to use papacy's possessions. This did not entail the conferral of any ownership rights, as it was revocable as any license is. This license did not therefore affect the licitness of the friars' mere use of the necessities of life, as this use was given through natural, not legal right. Thus, the friars' natural licitness of use did not clash with their legal rightlessness, to which they had committed themselves by their vow. This natural right to the necessities of life was, according to Occam, the only link between the prelapsarian state of innocence and the postlapsarian fallen state. Crucially, this natural right had not come with ownership in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve had been given two powers by God, the power to use and the miraculous power to rule over the earth and animals. I don't exactly know what Occam has in mind here, but it's not supposed to be ownership. Hence, there was no ownership, not even communal ownership, in the state of innocence. Therefore, surprisingly, Occam rejected earth communism, the ancient idea of an original communism of property. After the fall, humans lost the miraculous power to rule the earth, but they kept the power to use necessities of life and were then also endowed, first, with the power to acquire, and then second, also with actual ownership rights through man-made agreements and laws. And according to Occam, this is then how private and communal property emerged, as a fitting arrangement for fallen humanity, following the dictate of reason. This suggests that, contrary to VA, for Occam, subjective rights were not unrestrained liberties, but reasonable means to reasonable ends in a politics oriented toward the common good. I'm quoting here McGrade. Contrary to John XXII, all ownership was thus a reasonable, if man-made arrangement, and could be renounced. If we did so or do so, we are reverting to original communism of use. For, as Occam wrote, it is licit to renounce property and the power of appropriating, but no one may renounce the natural right of using. and, contrary to other Franciscans, observing absolute poverty does not lead by itself to the innocence of paradise, as Bonaventure, for example, had claimed. Ockham's ethico-theological conception of communism was too closely attuned, in my view, to the limitations of humans in their present condition to be open to such self-deifying tendencies, in direct contradistinction, of course, also to modern communists such as Lenin or Mao. No connection then can be drawn from Ockham's nominalism to his alleged anarchical individualism. But is there at least some connection between his nominalism and his communism? This is not a much explored topic in the literature. Prima facie, there cannot be any connection. Communism is about community of use or ownership, whereas nominalism asserts the reality or sole reality of individuals. However, Ockham did subject the concept of a community or collective to a nominalist treatment. The reality of a community is nothing above or separate from its members. A collective is simply an aggregate of individuals, and the relations between them can be stated in terms of statements about their members and their properties, substance and quality. That follows from Ockham's nominalist account of the category of relations. Thus, Ockham expressly rejected the jurist's persona ficta concept. Ockham's nominalist argument for communism would then run as follows. First, post-lapsarian society contains property rights, which are legal rights. Second, post-lapsarian society is not as real as are its individuals. Third, the legal rights of post-lapsarian society are less weighty or less permanent than the natural rights of individuals. And then we can conclude, these natural rights are the perennial rights of communism of use. There is, however, something paradoxical about this argument, as it establishes a doctrine about what we are supposed to share by reference to individuals and their entitlements. How would we explain such an individual entitlement without reference to equity and a common good? The argument also clashes with the fact, stressed for example by Janet Coleman, that Ockham held that the dominion given to humans in the state of innocence was possessed by the whole species. And then, several conceptual problems follow from that. But I will skip this bit just to get to Wycliffe. These puzzling aspects of Ockham's communism only increase if we briefly turn to John Wycliffe, who died in 1384. Metaphysically, Wycliffe was Ockham's antipode, as he was a realist about universals. He distinguished between two types of universals: the Platonic ideas in the mind of God, which are immutable archetypes of everything, and the properties of individuals of a certain kind, as they share these properties in common. Both types of universals exist according to Wycliffe, and we can come to have certain knowledge of them. They are not the result of abstractive cognition, as Ockham had claimed. I quote Wycliffe here, "It does not depend on any created intellect that it is common to every fire to be fire," unquote. Wycliffe, however, was not a friar, but in his ethico-theological philosophy, he was very close to the friars, especially to the spirituals. Indeed, he was more radical than them, for he believed that it is the duty of all Christians to follow the gospel to the letter and follow Christ by living a life of humility and poverty. As he saw the church of his time deviating from this apostolic model, he demanded very vocally its disendowment by force. I will skip here his complex doctrine of dominion and grace and focus just on his communism, which also was a communism of use. Why? Because he believed that the ultimate owner of everything literally is God, and we can only use and administer his goods. As he wrote on Civil Dominion from 1376, all the goods of God should be common. This is proved thus. Every man should be in a state of grace, and if he is in a state of grace, he is Lord of the world and all it contains. So every man should be Lord of the universe. But this is not consistent with there being many men, unless they ought to have everything in common. Therefore, all things should be in common. Wycliffe seems to go here beyond Occam, allowing that humans can, indeed should be lords of the world now, not only in the Garden of Eden or at the end of time. Now, unlike in Occam's case, the link between Wycliffe's communism and his metaphysics is pretty straightforward. For, as he argues in the Tractatus de Universalibus on universals from 1368 or 74, while nominalism leads to selfishness, communism follows from our knowledge and love of universals. I quote, "All envy or actual sin is caused by the lack of an orderly love of universals, because every such sin consists in a will preferring lesser a good to a greater good, whereas in general, the more universal goods are better. If proprietors who are devoted to particulars were more concerned that the well-ordered commonwealth should thrive, then their kinfolk should prosper, they should not press for their own people to be raised to wealth, office, prelacy, and other dignities. They would aim a little higher and want what is the more appropriate thing for the general public." Wycliffe was, of course, concerned with the possessive individualism of his time, the corruption within the church. But we can easily modify his argument to make it relevant to the excesses of our own possessive individualism. The root cause is the same, a love for money and external goods at the expense of higher goods and more general goods, such as, of course, now the good of future generations. But does the metaphysical underpinning of communism in Wycliffe not threaten its ethical character? Yes, this objection can be raised. As everything has its archetype in God, the community of the saved is already predetermined, as is the community of the damned. And since we can have certain knowledge through reason of the universals, we should be able to say, without a shadow of doubt, who belongs to our communist state, the eternal church, and who is to be thrown out of it. No ethics is needed here, just policy making based on rational cognition. But it would be unfair to impute this almost Leninist position to Wycliffe, for he remained convinced, like most in his age, that in our present state we cannot know who is saved and who is not. This epistemic opacity blocks fatalism and also the overconfident persecution of the sinners. Everybody is called forth to explore his heart by means of reason and to study and follow the Bible. Of course, this makes Wycliffe's metaphysical underpinning of communism lose some of its bite and strength. For if I cannot know who belongs to the eternal church, then I am unable to cognize the Platonic archetype of the eternal church, which undermines Wycliffe's rationalism about universals. I am then left, in practice, with what already Olivier, Occam, and other Franciscans were preaching, namely the imitation of Christ through a communism of use and works of charity. This then resolves our paradox. There is no path from metaphysics, nominalism or realism, to medieval communism, but there is a path in the other direction. A certain general ethical outlook could be given, as an alleged rational support, a metaphysical gloss. As Brian Tierney put it, any medieval author who was clever enough to be a scholastic philosopher in the first place was quite capable of associating any preferred set of metaphysical premises with any chosen political stance. Occam's theory of rights was compatible with his nominalist philosophy, but it was also compatible with any philosophy that acknowledged, as all Christian philosophers did, the existence and value of individual human persons, unquote. Okay, I was not tell you, I have a short section on how this whole story unraveled, just to quickly wrap it up. So unfortunately, fortunately, this whole story of medieval communism is not a success story, because all the theories of properties which then followed upon the Middle Ages were basically in favor of private property. So private property, in short, won the game, and so did possessive individualism. You can see that, of course, if you look at the various theories of property developed in the 16th and 17th century all over Europe, no matter which religious or non-religious camp you belonged to. Something similar to an ethical communism did survive in the literary genre of the utopia. However, if we mistake these utopias for a blueprint, I mean, of course, Thomas More, Campanella, Varese, Morelli, etc. So if we take these utopias not so much as simply literary moral correctives, but as a blueprint for future human societies, then it is surprising to realize that their increasingly rigid scientific constructions don't actually point to paradise, but to the future communist prison states and the Gulag camps. Take, for example, Etienne Gabriel Morelli, author of a communist utopia, the Basiliade, published in 1753. He wrote, "It is a sacred basic law of nature," God doesn't play a role anymore, it's now nature, of nature, he argued, that the abolition of private property removes the sole cause of human misery. Whoever attempts to reintroduce private property, he wrote, is to be treated as an enemy of mankind and, I quote, imprisoned in a cave in the public cemetery. His name forever erased from the citizens' registry. To conclude, it is clear that in its increasing focus on a scientific and economic approach to the community of goods, in total disregard of the needs and workings of the human soul, modern communism has gone astray. The lessons we need to draw from modern communism are mostly negative. Do not expropriate humans by force and do not destroy the roots of creative entrepreneurship. But there are some positive payoffs, at least that's what I'd like to argue, of understanding medieval communism, some of which may well be relevant for our own road ahead. These are as follows. 1, a moral psychology about the nature of capitalist temptations. 2, the normative and conceptual challenges involved in renouncing ownership or capitalism. 3, an ethical outlook on communism, which may mitigate climate change and environmental destruction. 4, an account of the goods which ought to be accessible to all, including air and water, which is, of course, a matter of huge importance in the Anthropocene. And 5th, some models of life for an age of scarcity, should it ever come to that. Thanks.